Delight yourself in the Lord, here on Second Chance Ministry Radio. Who was Artemis of the Ephesians? By Professor Robert Kennedy.
Artemis of the Ephesians. When Paul preached the gospel in Ephesus, his success in converting Gentiles there from the worship of idols to the worship of the one God and God's Messiah set off a powder keg. Before long, a certain Demetrius, a maker of souvenir silver replicas of the goddess Artemis, had rallied thousands of the city's citizens to gather in the theater pictured here to protest Paul's activity. One can almost still hear the echoes of the chant they took up for 2 whole hours. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Acts chapter 19, verses 21 through 41. Why would the citizens react to Paul by holding a kind of Artemis revival in the theater? Artemis was worshipped in many of the cities of Asia Minor, but Ephesus was home to the greatest temple of the goddess. Today, very little remains of this great temple of Artemis. After the Christianization of the empire, the perfectly cut stones of the derelict temple were quarried for new buildings. For example, the medieval fortress that now sits on the brow of the hill overlooking the neighboring city of Seljuk. In Paul's time, however, the great temple of Artemis was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world and a major destination for pilgrims and tourists from all across the Mediterranean. At 450 feet in length and 225 feet in width, the roof was supported by more than 120 towering columns. Artemis was not known in this region in her Greek dress. Rather, she was often portrayed as a mother figure, her chest covered with symbols of fertility, flanked by 2 deer. Scholars debate whether these symbols should be understood as breasts, eggs, or even the testicles of bulls. It is clear, however, that the more ancient worship of the mother goddess of the region was joined with the worship of Artemis when the region became part of the Greek Empire in the 4th century BCE. There was also a smaller temple of Artemis that stood beside the city hall and council chamber in Ephesus. Near the turn of the era, a portion of this temple was dedicated to the worship of Julius Caesar. After Julius Caesar was assassinated, the Senate of Rome declared him to be a god. The city elders of Ephesus consecrated this temple also to the worship of Julius Caesar as a sign of their loyalty to the new regime of his adopted son, the Emperor Augustus. Many inscriptions bear witness to the importance of both Artemis and the worship of the emperor for the life of the city. This inscription begins with a dedication to both Ephesian Artemis and Augustus. Artemis was so closely linked with the prestige and well-being of the city that the Ephesians laid particular claim to her as, in some sense, their own. The inscription goes on to recognize one Vibius Gaius as Philartemis kai philos Sebastos, a friend of Artemis and friend of Augustus. What gives Vibius honor in this city is his piety toward, and perhaps his financial support of, the cults of Artemis and the emperor in the city. Artemis was the patron goddess of Ephesus and its principal claim to fame. In such a city, Paul was destined to run into trouble. His proclamation of one and only one God threatened the city's very identity and its claim to fame, not to mention the livelihood of the craftsmen like Demetrius, whose trade depended upon the reputation and worship of Artemis of the Ephesians. The riot that resulted in the theater shows us the importance of the traditional gods like Artemis to the identity and livelihood of the cities in which Paul proclaimed his revolutionary gospel.
You are listening to Second Chance Ministry Radio.